Her parents would walk in on her as, or so they thought, she was making love to some strange man. But turns out it was something much, much darker than that. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Jodie Serrin. Viewer discretion is advised. Jodine, who would actually go by Jodie to her family, she was born on November 21st, 1967 in Los Angeles, California, but her family would very soon move out of state. The family would actually move to Walton Hills, Ohio, which is where Jodie spent the majority of her life. She would graduate from Bedford High School in 1986. And then sometime after that, she would end up moving with her family back to Southern California, this time specifically to Carlsbad. And this case kind of hits home to me a little bit because I was born in Escondido, California, but I lived the majority of my young life in Oceanside, which is like 5-10 minutes from Carlsbad, depending on, where you are. Carlsbad is home of the very first Legoland amusement park, a place I have never been to and probably never will. Now, Carlsbad is considered a very, very affluent city. It's actually one of the top 20 wealthiest cities in the United States. I like to basically call it the Scottsdale, Arizona of Southern California. Now, as of right now, it's kind of like right in the middle in terms of being in terms of safety of the city. But back when this case took place, Carlsbad was perceived as a very safe place to live. But anyway, back to Jodie. Jodie was someone who absolutely adored flowers, and she loved to make floral arrangements. And there in Carlsbad, in that area, flowers were very plentiful. There was just something about them that she felt brought so much beauty to the world and so much joy and happiness and smiles to people's faces. Eventually, she would actually get a certificate in floral design. Jodie was definitely an animal lover. In particular, she really loved horses. In fact, she had her own horse, this pretty little white horse, and she named him Sam, and she loved to ride him. She loved horseback riding. She also loved to ice skate. She loved to bike. She loved doing crafts. She was a very, very involved person. She just loved doing things. She loved getting out and just enjoying life as every day came by. She also loved the beach, and she just so happened to live next to some of the most beautiful beaches in the country. Jodie was also a special needs individual. She had some mental impairments. I'm not exactly 100% sure what they were, but she was considered very high functioning, meaning she could work, she had her own place, she could live on her own. She still needed help with some things like driving she could not do. And her parents, even as she was, at the time of this story, she's about 39 years old, her parents were still very involved in her life, and they would check on her every single day. They would call her at least twice a day. They would stop by her apartment or her condo. They had a spare key to her place just because, there were times where she needed help. Her family would say that her, mental impairments really didn't hinder her much. They didn't slow her down. They didn't cause trouble in her life, and she very much embraced it. She had a large circle of friends within the disabled community that she loved dearly. So between her community and her family, especially her parents, Jodie was really well taken care of, and she was clearly very, very loved. But her life would come to an unfortunate and very sudden end on February 14th, 2007, Valentine's Day. She lived in her own condo. She had no roommates. And like I said, it was very routine for her parents to at least call her a couple of times a day, specifically more in the morning and then again before bedtime, just to make sure everything was good, but also just to catch up with her. By the late evening of February 14th, her parents had their own, Valentine's date night. They had gone to dinner. They had then gone to a movie, and the movie let out sometime around 10 p.m. And Jodie's father, his name was Art, he realized that they hadn't heard from Jodie literally all day long, and that was very unusual. So Art and, his wife, Lois, would just take a quick stop by Jodie's condo just to make sure everything was okay. When her parents walked up to her condo, the porch light was on, and it looked like there was lights on the inside, but they couldn't tell for sure. So they knocked on her door, to no answer. They started to call her name, no answer. They knocked again, nothing. So they would turn the doorknob, and the door was unfortunately locked. But, like I said, they had a spare key to her apartment in case of an emergency. So Art took out the key, and he unlocked the door and tried to open it. Still locked. The security chain was hooked up, but there was that crack where you can kind of see into the apartment, and then at that point, they can confirm, all the lights were on inside. It appeared that Jodie had been there at some point very, very recently, but they didn't see her, and they didn't see signs of anyone. So they called out her name again, and again they get nothing, no response whatsoever. Art then makes the decision, because what if something is wrong? So he makes a decision to bust the door in. So he runs into the door to get the chain lock loose, and it works. He busts the door open. So her parents walk inside her condo. Again, everything seems normal. There's no unusual sounds happening. Everything is just perfectly fine, it seems. Once again, they call out her name. Once again, they hear nothing. They're kind of assuming at this point, okay, maybe Jodie's just in the shower. She's taking a really long shower, and that's why she doesn't hear us. Okay, fine. And then they hear a sound coming from Jodie's bedroom. So Art would go to her bedroom door and kind of quietly call out her name, and he got no response. He did a nice little knock on the bedroom door. Again, nothing. So he decides to crack open the door, and he slowly opens it, and Jodie's parents are taken aback. They are very, very surprised, because what they see is a man on top of their daughter, and it appears that they are having sexual intercourse. So his parents, or her parents, are like, oh shit, sorry. And so they kind of bolt out of the room and kind of go down the hallway a little bit. And at that point, because her parents are so oh my God, frazzled, they basically scream to the man, get your stuff, get your clothes on, and please leave the condo, please, now. So they kind of walk to the hallway, give him a few minutes to collect his things, and leave. Obviously, both parents are extremely embarrassed at this point, and they have to imagine that Jodie is equally as embarrassed. But Art and Lois also kind of quickly realize, why didn't Jodie make any sound when they walked in? Why didn't she scream? Why didn't she do anything or react? So, at any rate, her parents wait kind of down the hallway, and again, they give them a few minutes to leave. But they realize they don't see anyone leaving. They don't hear any sounds. Nothing is happening, it appears. So this time, Art goes back to her room, and he, this time, again, knocks aloud, Jodie, we're coming in. We want to make sure everything's okay. So then they wait a second, and then they open the door again. And this time they're met with something horrific. The man, he was gone. Jodie was lying very motionless on the bed. They called out to her. Jodie didn't respond. They walked up to her and kind of tried to rustle her a little bit, and she wasn't reacting or responding, and they noticed that her skin felt very cold. Art realizes Jodie's not breathing. And then, as he kind of sort of collects his thoughts, they both notice that she has bruises and injuries to her body, very bad, as if she was beaten. So he panics and he gives her CPR, hoping that might resuscitate her. But it doesn't work. Jodie, their 39-year-old daughter, is dead. Absolutely devastated, they call police, and an ambulance arrives, and they confirm that Jodie is deceased. the medical examiner who would arrive on the scene would make this story so much worse. Jodie was very cold to the touch, and they were able to determine that she had likely been dead for at least a few hours. Meaning that when her parents walked in on what they thought was her having intercourse with this man, that was not the case. He was having intercourse with her dead body. Which, I mean, I can't even imagine being in their position, having walked in on that, not realizing what it was, and then later realizing what it was, and just sort of like that insane level of like helplessness and just devastation to have to experience that with your own daughter. The police investigation would begin immediately. The first thing they check for is, how did this person get inside? All of the windows were closed. All of them had screens. All of the windows were locked. There was only one door in and out of the condo itself. That was the front door. Other than where Art kicked in the chain lock, there was no signs of forced entry. So they had to come to the conclusion that Jodie let this man inside her apartment. So did she know him? Her parents got kind of a decent look at him, but not really. But they thought they recognized the man as someone within her circle of disabled friends. Now, police would later check this man's alibi. They would also check, compare his DNA, because DNA in their investigation, they realized, was left behind in Jodie. So they had the man's body fluids. But it did not match the man that Art thought it could have been. So that man was completely cleared. But at any rate, Jodie must have let the man in, but this is not confirmed even to this day. So the exact scenario in which the man got inside the apartment is really unknown. But Jodie did have a very charitable, very friendly demeanor. She was very hospitable, so it's very possible he could have said something to convince her to let him in the apartment. Now, how did he get out without the parents seeing or hearing anything? The only thing they can come to the conclusion was that since he did not leave through her bedroom window, because again, it was locked, the screen door was on, where the parents were waiting after they walked in and what they did, they were kind of in a corner of the condo where they could not see the front door and they could not see Jodie's bedroom door. So this man must have been just incredibly bold and just darted out of her room and out of the front door of the condo and then fled. This would later be confirmed when police were questioning witnesses in the condos. And one lady said, a neighbor said she saw a man running from Jodine's apartment and just bolted down this embankment and fled. But unfortunately, she did not get any kind of good look at the man's face at all. And that kind of makes it even more terrifying that this man who had murdered their daughter was now in this condo with these two people alone, not knowing, they didn't know this was her murderer. And that's just very scary to think about. Her parents would also walk around the condo for police to see if anything was missing, and nothing was gone. There was nothing stolen. Her purse, her wallet, any jewelry she had was all left out in the open, and not a single thing was taken. So they don't believe this was robbery. So ultimately they concluded that the motive behind this murder was sexual in nature. And like I said just a bit ago, they did find DNA on Jodie that was not hers. It was obviously the man's DNA. They ran it through the system, but unfortunately it did not hit anyone. No one in the system would match the DNA. Police would question all of her neighbors and all of the circle of friends she had. They would question every person in her life, and they got nothing. There was She had no enemies. She was not in any kind of bad relationship. She didn't have any jilted exes. Her coworkers, all in good spirits. Everything in her life was great. She literally had no one negative. So this had to be one of the worst types, a random murder. Those are the hardest ones to track down and the hardest ones to find. Especially a man who left behind almost nothing other than his DNA. But there were like no, hair samples. There was no shoe prints, foot impressions, fingerprints, nothing. They had nothing. So it looked like if they were never going to get hit on DNA, this was never going to get solved. So ultimately, the DNA had to play the role of hero in this case. And thankfully, it would. It would be 10 years after Jodie's murder, so now we're in 2017. As you all know, fans of, true crime stories, DNA technology is constantly advancing. And we are now at a level where you could plug DNA into a system and it could give you like a composite of the person that likely would match that DNA. And that's pretty much exactly what police would do. They would run the DNA from her case every chance they could, but it never matched anyone. So what they did, they went to Parabon Nanolabs, which what that was doing at the time was it was like this new digital technology that once you put in the DNA, it would create a digital image of a person, a generic person. And it would know essentially what, if they were male or female, it would know their skin color, it would know their heritage, their ancestry, their eye color, their hair color. It would know like if they had what the shape of their face was. It's very cool actually how it all works. And you might remember that it was this technology or something very similar to it that helped eventually catch the Golden State Killer not too long ago. So, when they plugged in the DNA from Jodine's case, it would say that it belonged to a man in his 30s to 40s. He was of European descent. He was likely very light-skinned or white. And it produced an image. And this image would be circulated around the media and just sort of everywhere, especially in the area where Jodine lived. Also where she may have worked, just in case maybe anyone would recognize the person, and eventually someone did. In November of 2018, a witness would come forward to say that this image has a resemblance to someone I knew back then, and his name was David Mabrito. In 2007, he was vaguely known kind of by police. He was considered, I guess, more along the lines of a transient at the time. He was 38 years old. He was white, so he was in the age range, skin color. He was of European descent, so everything was matching. So great, let's go get him. Let's bring him in for questioning and let's test his DNA. They couldn't do it. This is because in 2011, right around the anniversary of the murder of Jodie Serrin, David would take his own life, so he was deceased. Police would look into his file and realize, he was arrested at one point, and they collected his DNA. Perfect. Well, that DNA was gone. It was somehow lost. Shit. Well, now what do? We need to be able to at least confirm it was him so that we can either move on from him or say this is our guy and we can close the case and give her family some closure. Well, they found out that David had an ex-wife who they had a son with together. The son was now, at the point of the investigation, he was a teenager. And the wife and the son fully cooperated with police. They asked if they could take a sample of the son's DNA because they can get a partial match. If David was the one to do it, then the son's DNA would be a partial match. And they were like, absolutely, do what you need to do. Here you go. And so they got a sample of the son's DNA. They ran it against the crime scene. Bingo. It was him. So it would be confirmed that Jodine's assaulter and murderer was David Mabrito. And it should be noted that the ex-wife and son had nothing to do with him in 2007 when this happened. They weren't really in each other's lives very much at that point. So this was a complete and utter shock and surprise to them, just as much as anyone else. But unfortunately, from what I understand, they got some harassment from people in the community, which was completely unwarranted. But I guess people were taking their anger out on someone, but it was undeserved. They had absolutely no connection to this whatsoever. So even though the bad guy didn't go to prison and didn't face justice, at least Jodine's parents and her friends, her family, at least they got closure and they found out who it was that did this, and now they know that this man will never do anything like this to anyone ever again. This is a case that shows you how amazing technology is in the realm of forensics, true crime in general. Like I said, it's constantly evolving. DNA is always advancing. These super intelligent people can do all these really smart people things, and they can solve crimes now with like the teeniest, ittiest bit of evidence, like a tiny drop of blood, and boom, you're convicted now. It's cool. It's evolving so much that hopefully eventually this really lowers the overall crime rate. Fingers crossed, but people will still do shitty things no matter if they know they can get caught really easily, because in the end, people will always be people. But yeah, like a skin cell flakes off of your fingertip and it gently falls onto something in the crime scene, or one single strand of hair, boop, and it flutters down on top of like your victim. Boom, DNA, done, you're arrested, gone forever. It's just cool. I think that's really cool. But that is it for this case today.
Okay, could you describe this sound for us?
Okay, it was about this loud. And then about a minute and a half later, half a minute later, I heard...
Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Noreen Boyle. Viewer discretion is advised. Noreen Marie Schmid was born on September 28th, 1945, and she was born in Philadelphia in Pennsylvania. By the time Noreen was about 16 or 17 years old or so, she was working at a little diner in Pennsylvania, and while working there, she met a 19-year-old man named John Boyle. John had been serving in the Navy. The two of them would hit it off pretty quickly and would end up, dating. They both would attend the University of Pennsylvania. John was attending the medical school portion of the school, and Noreen was going there for dental school. Eventually, Noreen would find a job as a dental hygienist, and John was continuing medical school, and basically Noreen was funding it. As she worked, she paid for his school. He, I guess, was specifically studying osteopathy. They would eventually get married, and they would kind of bounce around a little bit. They were in Pennsylvania, they were in Florida, they spent time in Virginia, but eventually they would settle down in Mansfield, Ohio, a quiet, peaceful little community. On February 28th, 1978, their son, Collier Landry, was born. When this case occurs, Collier is now 11 years old. In 1989, the couple had also adopted a 3-year-old girl, and they named her Elizabeth. Collier and his mom, Noreen, were incredibly close. They were a very tight duo. He would later on go on to say that his mom was his rock, and he was hers. Noreen was the absolute center of his universe. They bonded over so many different things. They loved the same things, and they were just a very close companionship. He would do anything for his mom, and he would do anything to protect her or defend her if that was ever the case, even at a young age of 10 or 11. And there were times where he felt he may have had to defend his mom against his dad. He and his dad, on the contrary, did not have a great relationship. John Boyle was known to be physically abusive at times, very emotionally abusive. He was a scary guy. Collier would later go on to say that there were times where he and his mom were petrified to be in the house with him. Collier also kind of took on a more adult sort of persona because he would discover that his dad was having an affair with a woman later named as Sherry Lee Campbell. And Collier found out that this woman was pregnant. Collier, being the very protective son and very close to his mom, would tell Noreen, I think Daddy's having, I think he's with another woman. I think he's seeing somebody else. At first, Noreen's a little hesitant to believe it, but ultimately she does, because Collier told her that he saw a ring on this woman's hand. His dad was not even remotely ashamed of introducing this woman to Collier, but it looked as if John was planning to marry this woman, even though he's still married to Noreen. And so by the time, Collier tells this to Noreen, she kind of starts figuring things out on her own. With the abusiveness, emotional and physical, with Collier not being comfortable in the house, afraid for their daughter Elizabeth, she eventually will file for divorce. She does so in November of 1989. The divorce proceedings essentially had just gotten started, but around this time, John had purchased a new property in Erie, Pennsylvania. This really big, lavish, beautiful home on a very large open property. And I think the plan was eventually for them to relocate to that home in Pennsylvania. John was still going through with it, even though Noreen is basically saying, hey, I'm divorcing you. And during the initial portions, in the late November or so, early December, Noreen is having a conversation with her son Collier, and she flat out tells him, if anything happens to me, it's your dad. He did it. That obviously gave him a lot of concern, but he also wasn't he wasn't not believing it. He would believe that his dad might do something to her. Which takes us to December 30th, 1989. At that point, the holidays, Christmas had just passed. John's mom is in town visiting. They're at their home still in Mansfield, Ohio. And according to a witness, Noreen was on a phone call with a friend that same night. And Noreen told the friend in a joking manner, well, I guess, John's not going to kill me tonight because his mom's here, so he wouldn't do that. This was actually one of the last things Noreen would ever say to anyone. Rolling into December 31st, it's now the very, very early morning hours. It's about 3 o'clock in the morning. 11-year-old Collier woke up to what sounded like a scream, a female screaming. Then he heard a loud thud. And then 30 seconds to a minute passes by, he hears another thud. 3-year-old Elizabeth was actually sleeping in the room with Noreen and John. 3-year-old Elizabeth would later tell police that she saw Daddy hit Mommy, and then made some mention of a bag, rolled her up like a snowman in a bag, something like that. Collier wakes up from, his sleep after hearing all these noises, and he kind of walks around the house where he eventually goes down and sees his dad sitting on the couch. Now, he had waited some time before leaving his bedroom. I think it petrified him, these noises and the scream and all that. So this was a little bit sometime later. When he notices his mom is no longer in the house, he asks his dad, where is she? And John responds to him with, oh, Mommy's took a vacation, a really sudden impromptu vacation. And after a day or so, and he hadn't heard from his mom, Collier's like, well, shouldn't we do something? Maybe report her missing? And his dad was like, no, you're not going to do that. If you do so, I'm going to punish you. Collier was convinced his dad did something to his mom. He just knows who his father is, his behavior in the past, his violent streak, the fact that he knows he's having an affair, he might have gotten another woman pregnant, the fact that there's a divorce going on, those noises he heard, the screaming, he knows something happened. And so he actually ends up calling all of Noreen's friends and coworkers and family and saying, I'm really concerned about something that happened to my mom. Again, he's 11 years old when he's doing this. And at that point, the friends and family are also now concerned, and they report Noreen missing to the police. So by January 1st, 1990, police are now interviewing John at his house with regards to his missing wife. John tells police, me and Noreen, we got into a loud argument. She threw this big old stack of credit cards at me, screamed at me, and stormed out. He then says he saw her running out of the house, getting into a car driven by someone he did not know. He had never seen the car before, and Noreen left, and she hasn't been seen since. Now, he says this happened around 10 p.m., which already everyone knows is a lie. First, Collier heard the thuds and the scream at 3 o'clock in the morning. This was hours after John claims he last saw Noreen. The other thing is that there were neighbors who were outside around that time who did not see anyone leaving the Boyle residence at 10 p.m. or 11 p.m. or midnight. They didn't see any cars driving away. They didn't hear any cars driving up or away. They were completely contradicting John's story. Meanwhile, John and John's mom basically infer that Collier was the one to report his mom missing after they told him not to. And so they became even bigger assholes to him, including John's mom. His own grandmother was also being a complete dick to Collier. Now, unbeknownst to John, Collier is actually working with police. Again, this 11-year-old child is basically going to police in these like secret little meetings and saying and giving them all the evidence he might have collected or had with regards to what's, happening with his dad. He says he found pictures of his dad with this other woman at the Erie, Pennsylvania house, this brand new house. John would later go on to tell police, I think you're like hypnotizing my kid. You're manipulating him to say things against me because you want me to be the person whoever did whatever to Noreen. I didn't do anything to her. Well, police are looking into his movements, and they uncovered that John had went to a rental place to rent a jackhammer, and he rented it in Mansfield, Ohio. And he did so 2 days before Noreen disappeared. They also would look at the contract of this house that they purchased in Erie, Pennsylvania, because I think everyone assumed that Noreen really knew about it and that she was the one to sign the documents and all that for the house, purchase of the house. Well, when police speak to the actual people involved with selling the house, they are shown a picture of Noreen and they're like, that's not the woman we saw. That's not the woman who was with him. And the name on the signature name underneath John's was a name that was written as N. Sherry Boyle, which would indicate the N would be for like Noreen Sherry Boyle. However, Sherry was not Noreen's middle name, but that name was lining up with the mistress. John Boyle also had inquired about to the people who were selling the house, like, can we, dig up the basement? Can we lower the basement floor a little bit? And his excuse was, well, my son Collier likes to play basketball and I would like him to be able to do it in the basement. It's random. John Boyle was also very persistent. He was adamant that that house in Erie needs to be cleared out so that I can move in by January 1st. It was like a sudden thing. He needed it to be done. They would also investigate the mistress, Sherry Campbell. They go to a property that's actually owned by her uncle, and they see this massive chunk of cement, these big cement blocks that have been just sort of on the side yard of the mistress's uncle's property. That's very strange because there was no concrete being dug up anywhere on the uncle's property. And so they finally are able to get a warrant to search the new home in Erie, Pennsylvania. When that warrant is granted, Collier tells the detective he's been working with, my dad said he's taking me to Florida. I'm not sure if I'm coming back alive. But by the time before they were able to leave for Florida, the police intervened and served the warrant so that John had to stay there. They noticed the basement flooring. There was a large chunk of it that appeared to be brand new. It was also still kind of soft, like it wasn't totally cement yet. And they saw these brand new shelving units built in over this new cement. So the warrant allows them to remove all of that new shelving. And they also found this big thing of, green carpeting that they confirmed that John had purchased from a local store in the days leading around the disappearance of Noreen. And that's the green carpeting they found underneath or above the cement. So they pull up the carpeting. They also then begin to shovel away the cement because it's still really soft. And as they keep digging, the cement is even, still not solid yet down there. They find that there's an odor that permeates from this still soft cement, and it smells like death. And they continue digging and digging until they uncover a human body. It was the body of a woman. The woman was nude, and she had been in a pretty serious state of decomposition at that point. The woman had a Rolex wristwatch on, and it was engraved with Noreen's initials. The watch stopped on December 31st, the very same night Noreen disappeared. The coroner would eventually determine that these were the remains of Noreen Boyle. Noreen had died of suffocation and blunt force trauma, which goes in line with what 3-year-old Elizabeth said, that Daddy hit Mommy with something, basically implying that he bludgeoned her over the head. And John Boyle was the one and only suspect in this, and that was large in part due to his 11-year-old son, Collier, basically ratting him out and working with detectives. He was extremely brave to do any of this. He knew how violent his dad was. He knew how scary his dad was and what he may do to him, if anything should happen. But John Boyle is then arrested and charged with the first-degree murder of Noreen. The prosecution's star witness was Collier himself. Collier would recount this statement on the stand.
I told her, I said, Mom, please sit down. And she says, why, Collier? I said, just please sit down. There's something I have to tell you. And she said, okay. I said, I think Daddy has a girlfriend. And then she said, well, Collier, that's impossible. He can't have a girlfriend. And I explained to her that Daddy had kissed her and hugged her and stuff like that. And I admitted to my mother that I did, and she said, that's okay. She said, I knew I was in an impossible position. I heard a thud, a little.
Okay, could you describe this sound for us?
Okay, it was about this loud. And then about a minute and a half later, half a minute later, I heard a thud like this. It was even louder. And at that time, I was petrified. I was just scared.
He flat out said, my dad did this. He killed Noreen. This is what I heard that night. This is what I saw that night. And he testified how abusive he was, how manipulative he was, how he was cheating, having affairs, having babies with other women. All of this stuff Collier saw. He testified about it at trial. This was a very high-profile case. This is a guy who is now in the medical profession, who's a very prominent figure in the community, a very wealthy man, seemingly liked by people who didn't really know he was a monster. But it was his own son that did him in. And John Boyle was convicted of his wife's murder and sentenced to prison. He got a life sentence with the possibility of parole after 20 years. Collier, Landry, and Elizabeth would eventually go into the foster care system, and Collier was soon adopted by a really lovely family, and they raised him. I'm not 100% sure what occurred with Elizabeth, though. But, the trauma that Collier experienced and having to testify against his own dad for killing his mom, a woman he was just... that's something that's going to mess a person up pretty badly. But he really kind of battled through it, and he eventually would move to Los Angeles, where he began working in films, and he's I think now a cinematographer, and he's doing really well for himself. I know he hasn't seen Elizabeth, his adopted sister, since 1990. So once this all happened, he never really saw her again. His story would be told in a documentary called A Murder in Mansfield. This case was at one point featured on Forensic Files. This was a really high-profile story. And at the center of all of it really was a mother and a son. A mother and a son who were a really close, dynamic duo. They loved each other very much. They were each other's best friends. And Collier stood up for his mom, even at the risk of his own safety, against his very unpredictable and violent, abusive father. He stood up to him, essentially. And he is one of the primary reasons why his dad's in prison. Later on, John Boyle would try to appeal, stating, well, that body that you guys found, that's not Noreen. You misidentified her. There's no way it's her. And so this would actually prompt them to exhume the body and do more thorough testing. And they confirmed without a shadow of a doubt that the woman they found buried underneath that concrete in the Erie, Pennsylvania home was Noreen. And it's like, Also, John, this was your house and a body was found underneath it in freshly dug cement after you told people, the homeowners, I want to dig up the basement. Like, even if it wasn't her, you had a body in your basement. Like, but it was her. Confirmed. No question about it. It was Noreen. And he is still, to this day, sitting in prison. He has tried to get parole many times, but so far, no luck, thankfully. His next parole hearing, from what I understand, is not set for October of 2025, which is the year I'm filming this. It's February 2025. But thanks to a very dedicated and loving son who was extremely brave, he was able to help get his mom's justice. And Noreen Boyle got the justice she very rightfully deserved. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Laura Burbank. Viewer discretion is advised. Laura Burbank was born in 1957, and she was living in Tacoma, Washington with her family. I don't really know much about her. This was from back in 1970, and she was only 13 years old, so there really wasn't much of a history. Laura would frequently go to a little animal or a pet store at the B&I shopping center in South Tacoma. She would go there all the time. And there was an adult employee there named David Fisher that apparently Laura befriended. I guess she would come into the store and he would always talk to her when she was looking at animals. And this is a 29-year-old man. So, allegedly, Laura goes into the pet store on June 29th, 1970. She has an interaction with David Fisher that people observe. Now, according to others, David Fisher had told Laura, hey, I'm going to be doing some training. I'm going to be training monkeys, but that's not going to be here at the store. It's actually at a different location. Would you like to come and watch that? Laura, being a 13-year-old girl, said, yeah, that would be really cool. I want to see some monkeys. And so he tells her that to meet him the following day, and he would pick her up. So the following day, on June 30th, 1970, Laura would ask her parents, can I go down to the pet store? And they said yes. She didn't tell them about David Fisher. So she leaves her house around 12 p.m. that day, and then her parents never see her again. It would be at approximately 2 p.m. when a neighbor to the Burbank family saw Laura basically sitting on a curb, and he was riding a horse. I guess he would ride his horse around the area. Well, the 13-year-old girl he observed was sitting in a parking lot with no one else around, and he said, hey Laura, how's it going? And she's like, I'm doing good. He goes, what are you up to? And she basically told him, I'm waiting for a friend to go train some monkeys. And, thinking that obviously her parents probably knew this was happening. He was just a neighbor. He didn't really dive too deep into this. He said, okay, well, have fun. About 20 or so minutes later, he rides his horse back the other direction and passes by that same parking lot, but now Laura is gone. So he assumed that whoever was picking her up picked her up. Later that afternoon, when Laura hadn't come back home, her parents obviously became very worried. Laura promised she would be home by a certain time that afternoon, and she never broke promises like that. She would always be back when she said she was going to be back. So at first, her parents go down to the pet store. They walk around and ask people, and they say that basically Laura hadn't actually been in the store that day, which was unusual to the parents because that's what Laura said she was doing. So they begin driving around the entire neighborhood, and they are looking all over for her, and they're having absolutely no luck. So Laura Burbank, the 13-year-old girl, was reported missing to police. Almost immediately, police were informed about David Fisher, that because the police would go to the pet store and they would talk to people there because they found out that Laura was there all the time and figured that's the last place she said she was going to be, so that's the best place to start. And so that's how they found out about her interactions with this 29-year-old guy named David Fisher. So police, and he wasn't at the store that day, so police would go to his house. He had a wife, a 16-year-old wife who was pregnant. So when police ask him, hey, witnesses have stated that you are seen talking to Laura all the time, and he said, well, it's a pet store. I talk to kids all the time there. We have a lot of kids who come in to look at the animals. And after seeing a picture of her, he actually had the nerve to deny he ever even knew her, that he never spoke to her, had no idea who she was, didn't recognize her. David Fisher seemed to not give two single shits about this missing 13-year-old girl. To police, he seemed very flippant, unemotional, uncaring. Something just did not feel right with this guy. But that being said, while he is obviously a suspicious dude and kind of a concern, they didn't have any evidence to say he actually did something to Laura. They had no physical evidence. They don't even know where Laura is. She could have run away for all they know. And that's one theory they had bouncing around, of course, was that 13-year-old girl. Maybe she got upset with her parents and she just bolted. She'll be back soon. But after about 2 weeks, police begin to think, okay, this is obviously not a runaway. This is a missing girl, and we are considering this a foul play scenario. This is an endangered missing child. Meanwhile, her parents and her family are just like sick with grief, and they're sick with unknowing where their daughter is, and they can't sleep, and they're a hot mess, obviously, as any parent would be. And then David Fisher's wife goes into the police station alone without her husband, and she tells them that one night David came home and he was extremely persistent with her about washing a particular pair of jeans he had. When she saw the jeans, they were completely filthy. They were dirty and they were gross, and he demanded her to clean them immediately. She had told police that David Fisher was, she described as, an immaculate dresser, and he never got his clothes dirty, and she had never seen anything he ever wore looked this filthy, not even remotely close ever before. She also tells police that when she was doing laundry roughly 2 weeks or so after Laura's disappearance, that the laundry had a single pair of girls' underwear, and it was not hers, and it was like a smaller size. And this was like very concerning to her, obviously. She didn't really know if it was like maybe just a smaller woman that he had interacted with, and maybe he was having an affair or what. She didn't really know for sure, but to her first gut feeling was these are like children's underwear. So Laura's parents, Ken and Dorothy, would look at those underwear when police had them finally, and they said they were Laura's, that they belonged to her. But they still didn't have Laura, and they didn't have any proof that she was dead or anything like that. But that proof would come 3 months later, 3 months after she disappeared. There were some kids playing near the Rainier Olympia Highway in some like wooded area. And this is in Olympia, Washington, approximately 25-30 miles away from where Laura was last seen. These kids found a body, basically partially buried. So they saw some of the body kind of sticking out of the ground, and when they inspected closer, they realized that this was a dead human buried under the ground. And so they went to police immediately. So police arrive and they unearth the body completely, and a couple weeks later, I think it was on September 22nd, they would finally identify that body as that of 13-year-old Laura Burbank. The coroner determined that she had definitely been sexually assaulted, and her cause of death was likely, from what they can tell by her skull, was a severe blow to her head. Once the information about the body being found, where it was found, other witnesses would come forward to state that they saw a truck that had the name of the pet store that David Fisher worked at, the one that Laura Burbank would go to, near that location where the body was found, around the time Laura had initially disappeared. No one thought anything of it, because why would anyone? But that was just further proof that David Fisher was likely responsible for this. Now, the evidence at that point was really circumstantial, but they had enough to issue an arrest warrant for David Fisher. So when they go to arrest him, he's gone. He fled. And then 8 days after that, he would turn himself into police with his lawyer, and he just said to the detectives, "All right, you've got me now." He actually had the balls to ask police, can you let me stay free, though, for just a few more days, because the birth of my very first child is happening. And police were like, oh, fuck you. No, you're under arrest for first-degree murder. You're not getting the right to see your child born. Sorry. Now, because police had virtually no physical evidence to directly connect him to this murder, all they had was the circumstantial stuff with regards to the pet store truck being seen near where her body was found. The underwear, I don't think they had any forensic conclusions to state that they were definitely Laura's. They just had the parents' identification of them. They had the fact that David Fisher lied about ever knowing Laura Burbank and said he had never seen her ever before, when tons of people at the pet store said they interacted all the time. He definitely knew who she was. They also looked at the fact that 29-year-old David Fisher was married to a 16-year-old girl and got her pregnant. They looked at that too as kind of like being a predatory type behavior. But again, circumstantial evidence, nothing really physical. So he actually would plead guilty to manslaughter, specifically second-degree manslaughter. And this was in 1971. He was sentenced to just 20 years in prison at the Washington State Prison in Walla Walla. Apparently, for the next 3 years, he was an outstanding prisoner. He was on his best behavior all the time. He was great. And that led to him being assigned to, I guess, the prison's minimum security farm. I guess they had a farm at the prison at the time. Unbelievably, and I don't understand this, this portion of the prison really didn't have any security fences or any high walls. And apparently had no supervision. There were, I guess, no one out there watching these prisoners work on the farm, because David Fisher, after he was assigned to that role, he just simply walked out of the prison. No one saw him. No one stopped him. He just was easily able to just freely walk out, and he escaped. No one even knew he was gone until midnight. This was almost 12 or so hours later when they were trying to do a head count. That's the first time they noticed that a prisoner had escaped. And so David at that point had just an insane head start. And police and the prison officials, they searched like crazy for him, but they couldn't find him. And literally for the next 15 years, David Fisher was just out there roaming the world, apparently free as a bird and nobody recognizing him. This is a man that a psychologist who worked with David Fisher, he would say that Fisher is, quote, interested in exploiting young, vulnerable girls. He will look for such targets. He will case them, and he will spend a lot of his time thinking about how he can go about overpowering them, controlling them, and using them for sexual ends. He is very interested in finding someone with whom he can carry out his fantasies, end quote. And so he's also a man that we know murdered a 13-year-old girl who obviously has issues, and now he's just out there. The same psychologist would say during this time when he was out that David did not recognize his own problems. He probably is not aware that he has a lot of internal turmoil. He has likely been like this for a long time. He has an antisocial personality, and he has deviant criminal behavior early in life, and it got worse as he got older, end quote again. During the time that David Fisher was out there in the world, there were several girls in that area who had gone missing / were murdered. 13-year-old Carla Wright. There was also 12-year-old Michaela Welch. 13-year-old Jenny Bastian. I think I've actually covered all of those cases either here or on TikTok, I think. And so because David Fisher was out there, they thought, well, he's probably responsible for all of those. But eventually, with DNA evolving and, just police investigation, they would determine that all 3 of those girls were not killed by David Fisher. They had arrested the people responsible for those crimes. So on March 21st, 1990, the show Unsolved Mysteries would air this case, not because of the murder he committed, but because of the escape, and he was a wanted fugitive. And so they aired it, and then on the night of the broadcast, the Unsolved Mysteries tip line would get a bunch of calls from people in Canada. These people would all say the same thing. They recognized him as a local door-to-door salesman named Michael Raymond Porter. And they were able to basically discreetly find out where he was, and they didn't blast this information out there so that to give him a chance to run again. So they were able to, on January 4th, 1990, they found out where this person was living. They went to the home and they found him and they arrested him. They were able to confirm it was him based on photographs, based on his tattoos, and so they know they had him. And apparently he had been living a great life. He had a wife who had been married to for the past 11 years. They had 3 kids together. Unbeknownst to her, she was married to a child murderer and had kids with him. It's not her fault. It's just, that's got to be a crazy shock to find out. When police showed up and they arrested him, he actually told them, yeah, I saw the show. I watched it. Saw me on there, and so I'm not surprised that you guys are here. So apparently he did know that police may be on the way, and maybe he was tired of running. Apparently, David Fisher's, his new wife, said that he always seemed like a caring and loving husband. He was great to the kids. Seemed like a good guy. And they confirmed that she had absolutely no idea about who he actually was. That being said, neighbors who lived near him would describe him as being a very strange guy, and he gave them the creeps in really subtle ways over the years. Go figure. They believe that David Fisher probably found himself in Canada within a couple of days of him escaping from prison. They learned that, I guess, he first went into Manitoba, and then when he was in, I guess, at something called Vancouver's Skid Row, he had purchased a new identification for just $50. Then he got a job as a salesman, and he just acclimated to this new fake life quickly, I guess. And kind of unbelievably, he would say that he did spend the majority of that time in Canada, the 15 years. But he actually said, I went back to Washington and Tacoma actually a couple of times over the years. That's bold, first of all. And unbelievably, no one recognized him at all when he came back. So I don't know the exact details. They seem to be they're kind of hard to find, but David Fisher was then brought back to the Washington State Prison in Walla Walla. I think he probably got some extra time for the fact that he escaped and was on the run for 15 years. But from what I can tell, at some point in the mid-90s, David Fisher was paroled and he was released back out into the world. And so, to my knowledge, he has been out there ever since. I don't know if he's still alive or not. Hopefully he's not. But it is crazy to me that a man sexually assaulted and murdered a 13-year-old child and escaped prison for 15 years, and he was still allowed to be put back out there. That's insane to me. There should be a man, you killed a 13-year-old child, boom, prison forever, never being released. You are a danger to everyone. But that's our criminal justice system for you. But that's it. David Fisher served his time and he was released. And so you have to wonder, did Laura Burbank truly get the justice she deserved? Personally, I don't think so. But that is actually it for this case, True Crime Rooney Dooney Dingleberries. So, hope you found it interesting as usual. But until the next case, True Crimerers, I shall see ya later. Yeah.